Today, on a very special day, I have my first guest, a man who needs no introduction. No, it's Leonard Boyarsky. I've known him for 30 years. We've been working together for much of that time, not all of it. He had his own adventures. And he looks exactly the same, and I look like the picture of Dorian Gray. So,
That
hi,
is
Leonard.
that is that is verifiably untrue.
People can go Google and make their own decision.
All right. How's it going, Tim? It's been so long since I've talked to you.
It's been minutes. Um,
Or days.
so, people have had a lot of questions on my channel that I honestly don't know the answer to. And rather than just make stuff up like I always do, I thought I'll just ask Leonard these questions. They're art questions, they're questions on quests I never worked on,
Well, that's
stuff
that's
about.
that's always the strategy, right? When you don't know what to do, you ask me.
Yep, that's been my strategy for 30 years. I don't know what's going on. Leonard, what are these colors everybody keeps talking? So, but before we jumped in, I kind of want people to know, like, how did you get into this business?
um, I needed a job, really. 100%. That's what happened. I went to school to be an artist. I really wanted to be an illustrator. Well, actually, let me step back a second. I was really into comic books, but I was also really into paintings like or painters like Norman Rockwell or Caravaggio. So I always had this weird push pull between being a comic book artist and being more of an illustrator. And I decided to go for illustration because it was way easier to put together reference and paint based on that than it was for me to create stuff out of my head. Which when 3D came along, that helped me tremendously, actually. So, anyways, I went to Cal State Fullerton, and then I went to Art Center. I went to school long enough to become a doctor, actually, which I love to tell people. Um, and basically, literally, what it did was it allowed me to waste enough time to graduate right at the time people were looking for artists for video games. That's not totally true. I learned a lot of actually really great stuff there, but literally the best thing that happened to me was because I was at Art Center when Walt Disney came and hired a bunch of my friends the semester before. After I graduated, I was looking for work. I couldn't find any. I had like got a couple of like small paperback book covers, album covers, things like that. But there was no way I was going to be able to support my family on that. I just called those guys up and I said, "Hey, is there any work where you guys are working?" And I got hired on a freelance basis to work on a children's game of all things. Um, I was the only artist on it, so I immediately became the lead artist on it, which shows you how the industry used to work because it was just craziness. They had no design, they had no designer. I really didn't have a big experience with games at all. I played stuff like Zork and Wizardry. Um, when I'd go to the arcade to play video games, I'd either play pinballs or watch my friends play because I was horrible at video games. But I love the art. Um, so I went to work there. Within a month or two, they're like, "Oh, our game. This we have no design for this game." So I'm sitting in the room with the people who are making this game, and we're designing a game, which I have no idea how to do that. And of course, not surprisingly, that got canceled. And then I was hired to cut things out of backgrounds for this game called Unnatural Selection. I actually got to do a little bit of interface art and a lot of touch up, pixel touch up on these horribly blue screened characters, and that indirectly led to me being hired at Interplay to cut things out of backgrounds.
The Stone Key, right?
So kids who are listening and want to get into the industry, it absolutely has nothing to do with your talent. It's like if you can fill the job they need at that time, or at least that was my experience.
Well, you didn't find that your dark sense of humor and anti-capitalistic tones factored into the design of that children's game?
No, I hadn't got that far in my creative abilities yet. Um, it was actually, I mean, it was interesting. It taught me a lot. I was using, it was 320, 200 giant pixels. I was actually, even though I was working freelance, I was going up to Burbank to work so they could teach me this is how different things were. When I went to apply for the job, I had a portfolio of oil paintings and acrylic paintings. I had no computer work. I'd never worked on a computer. I'd worked on Macs doing homework and stuff like that, writing papers. I'd never done any art on a computer. I showed him my portfolio. He's like, okay, this is great. When can you start? I'm like, oh, full disclosure, I don't know how to do anything on a PC. I had familiarity with Macs. I took a programming class in like 10th grade or something where we learned BASIC, and that was the extent of my computer knowledge. And he said, I could teach you how to use a computer in 3 days. I don't have time to teach you how to become an artist. Um, so fortunately, at that point in time, knowing art and being an artist was way more important than the technological or the technical skills. Then so I just
Oh, so that made us a good match because I didn't know anything about art, but I knew a lot about PC.
The reason I paused there, I just started thinking. I reflect on this fairly frequently. The whole thing is just weird, So like I have, I mean, I have paintings up on my website that I made. Um, I was fairly good at doing photorealistic paintings. I probably, if I had found the right people, could have made an okay living doing that. I wasn't great, but I was pretty good. Um, but I couldn't, and so I just, I got this weird job cutting things out of backgrounds, and because I needed the job so bad, I didn't, I could have been like all pissed off, like I have 2 degrees, I don't need to do this, I'm a trained artist, but I just did it, and I was working with this really cool guy named Nick, um, in his bedroom, literally. He pitched this project to Disney. He was recording this thing he had his own video camera. He had like a blue tarp behind it. It was just a bad setup for trying to cut things out. But I cut things out and replace parts because they'd get eaten away when you cut them out. Um, and then from there I ended up over at Interplay because the first place I worked, Quicksilver, never did anything except work with Interplay, except for this one time. So like this chain of weird events like led to Fallout, right? So I worked for a company that never works for anybody at Interplay, but this one time. That project gets canceled. I forget how I got back in touch with them. I think they were doing some stuff for Interplay. I did some paintings for castles, like they were doing an enhanced version of castles. So I did paintings for that. And somehow, I think I called them and I said, who do I talk to over at Interplay? And they sent me over to Todd Kamasta, and I showed him my stuff. And he's like, he was not impressed by my painting abilities. Well, because you needed to do pixel art. He wanted to see me create stuff out of my head and do the stuff that I really wasn't good at. That's what he was looking at. You needed, at that point, this was 32200 still. Um, you needed to be able to make pixels look like art, which was a totally different skill set. Um, so but at that time, Stonekeep was going, and they needed somebody to cut things out of backgrounds. So because I had this kind of weird job cutting things out of backgrounds, I got a job cutting things out of backgrounds at Interplay. Um, and from there, I worked on Stonekeep. I always wanted to work on RPGs. I love the idea of RPGs. I'd never really played RPGs.
Well, you started coming to the RPG Thursday night thing.
Yeah, well, but again, like I didn't ask what I was working on. They were doing other games besides RPGs at that point. I had no idea Interplay was an RPG company. Interplay was a company where I knew somebody who could get me an interview with the art director. That was literally as far as it went. It's like I wasn't like, this is the job I want. This is like, where is my job that I can support my family? So I go on. Oh, and the interesting thing that we've talked about is that I did get a chance to do a freelance job for them where I was painting these screens for this game that was called Rags to Riches. And, painting these oil paintings, then trying to scan that and dither it down to 320 by 200. Like some poor fool had to like try to figure out how to get those into the game. And I think that poor fool was you, Tim.
And do you know when that game shipped? 1993, 30 years ago.
Oh my God.
We're talking a long time ago.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is you went from school to work, you went from 2D to 3D, you went from never playing RPGs to playing RPGs to making an RPG. I mean, in a very short period of time, you had a lot of transition there.
Yes.
And none of it was planned, which sounds like Fallout.
Exactly, but I mean that's the path that led me there. I mean, I got my first D&D box when it was 1977 or 78, I think. So it was really, really early in D&D. I'd been reading about it in like fanzines and stuff, but I didn't know much about what it was. And I didn't know anybody who played. And if you try to play D&D without knowing anybody who plays it, or try to just play from the book, you die instantaneously. Um, so I read all the books that I had and just kind of fantasized about what playing an RPG would be like. And it was way more about the stories and being somebody playing in a world, being able to make decisions. It was, a holodeck. Can't speak this morning. It was kind of like a holodeck. It's, the ultimate expression of what an RPG would be. And it had very little to do with fighting in dungeons, which of course is, you could see where my inspirations come from or where I lean. So then when I started Interplay and I heard that, that you guys were playing RPGs on Thursday nights, that's when I first met you. Though when I first knew of you it had to be from Spencer Kipe or Rob Nessler was talking about like this guy, Tim Kaine, he was really sick. He had like this horrible chicken pox. And I like see, and I'm like, so I'd heard the legend of Tim Kaine, and everybody seemed to like you and everybody had this great opinion of you. But the thing I most knew was that you had just gone through this horrific chickenpox thing. And I saw you walking around one day and it looked like you're, 16 years old with like spots all over you.
It was terrible. People, do you know that chickenpox strain was so bad? There were adult people getting it who had it before, and several people died that summer from that strain of chickenpox.
Wow.
Yeah,
and then you really got strep at the same time, right?
Yeah, I was in a bad state, and we were trying to finish Rags to Riches, and they brought the computer to my house saying, "Can you please finish it?" And I answered, and I'm like, ugh. I look like death. I remember Fred Royal, Tom Decker's assistant producer.
Yeah, I remember Fred.
Fred took a step back when I opened the front door and just went, "Ugh," because I looked really bad. And I was like, "What do you want?" He goes, "They want you to finish the code." And I'm like, "I can't sit up." It was an interesting time. But
yeah. So we started playing GURPS. GURPS was the first RPG experience I ever had was GURPS.
And I remember you not only played one GURPS session, but then you came the next 2 nights to watch me play other people through the same session.
I hadn't remembered that. You told me about that when we started The Outer Worlds, how we had that conversation where I watched you play these people, watched you run 3 different groups through the same dungeon, and it was a completely different experience for each of them. And I was like, wow, I was really impressed by how many different scenarios you had planned for that thing. And you're like, I didn't have any of that. That was all on them making choices.
It was when we first talked about, yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, can we do that in a computer game? That seems like it'd be fun.
And I was like, yes, but it will be really hard. And I think you underestimated just how hard it was going to be. But that was the impetus of it all. It's like, if you went through it and then 2 other groups go through it. Yeah. And it seemed like a different dungeon.
Yep.
So it's interesting because, I really want to dive into some of the questions people have asked. I know when we talk about Fallout to journalists, they often seem a little dismayed at how much of it wasn't pre-planned from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, it's, continuing the thread of just weird things that happen. So I was working on Stonekeep and I was cutting things out of backgrounds and I was working with Rob Nessler mostly. And, I worked my way through that as quick as possible. And then Rob comes to my office and I was like actually getting to do little pieces of art. We're talking little tiny icons, right? Remember that inventory scroll that was on the right? Like I did a couple of those and some different little mini, tiny pieces of art. And Rob comes to me one day and he goes, we messed up when we told you how to cut these out because there was something about it. They had me cut them out where you could, I don't even remember what it was. It was like I was cutting some of them out where it was like they were cut off, but it's like they know they all need to be full screen and we're just going to crop them ourselves. But they had me crop them. And he's like, you're going to have to do them all over. And I literally went home and started making a new portfolio. I painted 3 or 4 paintings over the next month or 2. I'm like, I'm out of here. I can't do this anymore. I just can't. And I failed. I got no work out of that. If I had gotten work out of that, I would have quit because I just couldn't do it anymore. And worse than that, there was people on my team who shall remain nameless. One person in particular, who was also cutting things out of backgrounds. And this person was doing such a crappy job. They weren't fired. They're like, well, don't cut things out of background anymore. We will give you other art to do. And I'm like, if I had known all I had to do was be a crappy artist, or a crappy employee, I could have gone over to making actual art. Anyway, so I was like really upset with that. But then the other thing that happened is they got the SGI machines, the $30,000 machines, which is literally how much they cost. I actually checked with Rob when I was doing that presentation in Portugal. I'm like, Rob, how much were those SGI machines? He's like $30,000 a piece. And Interplay
kept them locked in a room.
Yeah, in Rob's office, they were using a Power Animator, which is a precursor to Maya. And Interplay, again, more luck or happenstance. Interplay had done all this research, like what's the best software we can use to make 3D graphics, and Power Animator was it. That's what people in Hollywood were using at the time, and they needed those SGI machines, which were $30,000 a pop, to run them. And they got that stuff, and then they started trying to find 3D artists, and then they realized, wow, everybody who knows how to make this is working in the movie industry, or use this software is working in the movie industry. We can't come anywhere near what they're making. And so they were sitting in the office, literally. I don't know if you remember where we were sitting there. I was like outside Rob's office. Yep. He'd come out and lock the door so nobody could get in there and like mess with the machines. And one day I'm like, I have to figure out how to use, and I tried it before. I tried 3D Studio Max. For some reason, I couldn't get into it. I'm like, I got to learn how to do 3D. I can't do this anymore. And I've asked Rob to let me in. Can I go in there at night after work? And so I'd stay up all night long after working at hours with a manual, because this was no internet. This was 93, with a manual, with no technical ability whatsoever, trying to figure out how to make a character in 3D. And to make matters worse, I was making that octopus slug creature, this amorphous creature with tentacles, which is just like, those are two things you don't want to try to do, even if you have experience, especially back then. And so I made that character, and they're like, yes, you can do 3D characters. So I started doing that, and I went from being this grunt artist to being a valued commodity, because I think I've heard you mention several times over the years about how much more we were making.
Oh yeah.
It was like every 3 to 6 months, they'd call us in and give us huge raises, because people were leaving constantly, because that was like the thing to be, was a 3D artist, because nobody knew how to do it. So again, it was only because I was so upset and so disgruntled at what I was doing, I became a 3D artist. Then I'm working very closely with Spencer, who was the art director on Stone Keep, and but Spencer decided to quit at the very end. He went all the way through Stone Keep, and then he quit. He would have been I'm pretty sure he would have been the art director for you if he hadn't quit.
I can tell you for sure, because I found my notes, and the original art director on what would become Fallout was listed as Spencer Kipe. And I was also going to say, another coincidence, do you remember how I got involved with the whole 3D artists with the SGIs in that locked room?
I forget. It was because you do Linux, right? Linux?
Unix. The operating system they ran was actually called IRIX, which was a sub-flavor of Unix, and none of the other programmers knew Unix. So every time you or Kevin Beardsley or another one of the artists would run into a problem, you'd come around the corner to where my office was. You're like, could you come fix the thing? The thing? I mean, you had a vague, and I'd go to him like, okay, let me fix this. Let me restart.
I had no idea about anything. I was which again comes to our next awesome fortuitous event. They hire somebody who only experience in business was I don't know his only experience, but what he had done most recently was he was a manager of Toys R Us. And Jason. He taught himself how to use 3D Max because his friend had gotten hired at Interplay with a pirated copy, which everybody did in those days. It's, I'm sure the statute of limitations is expired. And so Jason's like, I could do that. I'm done with this managing a Toys R Us. And so they hired him as the first official artist on your project. And we could not have made this. We could not have made Fallout without Jason. Jason was the glue that like, he was the translator between me and you. I had no idea how to do technical stuff. I could render stuff. I could do art. I could design stuff. Obviously, I could write, but
what was funny about that was, so here I am, and I have all those engines that I had made, the voxel engine, the sprite engine, that horrible 3D engine. Um, and what I wanted, I needed a group of people. So who did they assign to me? A scripter, but we don't have a scripting language, and a 3D artist who's brand new to the um, game scene, and there's no design, and there's no art style, and there's not even a defined setting, and they're both named Jason. So it was Tim and the Jasons, and I'm like, I need help. And that's when the whole pizza party thing happened, because it was like,
Yeah.
I need someone. We need a setting, we need a story. I'm not sure what to do. I don't know how to get this started. I'm not supposed to.
You've talked about the pizzas on pizza parties in your videos, right?
So yeah, far. I was told, well, don't go bug people, and I said I don't know what to do. So I bought pizzas. I think I bought them on my own dime because I technically didn't have a budget.
Yeah.
And I sent out that email saying I'm going to be in conference room 3 with some pepperoni and cheese pizzas after 6 p.m. if anybody wants to come by. And I thought like 15, 20 people would come by, and I think there was 7 or 8.
There was at that time at Interplay, I think, I'm trying to remember, in 90, that was like 93, 94. That was 90, still 93? No, it had to be 94. Was there more than 100? Was there more than 100 employees at Interplay at that point? We were like up to 150 or something.
Yeah, it was probably mid-hundreds at that point.
So, and I didn't know. I mean, I was, still, even though I had worked my way up to being a lead artist, which no one bothered to ever tell me. Actually, I found it as a lead artist when I saw the credits for the game, for Stonekeep. It was just, I get this email and I'm like, oh my God, like everybody's going to be there. This is, the whole company's going to be there. We get to make a game from scratch with like no parameters. It's like, we just get to create whatever we want. It's going to be standing room only. I show up, there's like 5 people.
What's funny about that is I've had people give me feedback going, how horrible were you to promote this work-life balance and take advantage of people's passion and all that? And I'm like, you're viewing this through a very modern lens. This was a bunch of super excited 20-somethings who were like, we have a chance to make our own thing.
Well, and we self-exploited.
Oh yeah.
I was as bad as any horrible boss in terms of like, how could this not be your life? You have a chance to make a game. You have a chance to do something really creative. And not only was it to make a game, it was to make a game with virtually no oversight where we could create whatever we want. And you're not like giving up every minute of your day to like do this. This is like, we have one shot at it, which, at the time, as you said, we were really young. We didn't realize how exploitive that was. And we didn't.
And you're right, we were exploiting each other. No one told us to do that. And in some ways, I often think that pizza party self-selected.
Yeah.
The Fallout group. These were people who really wanted to do it. They weren't ordered to do it. They weren't assigned to it. It was just, there was something in us that wanted to come out, and we didn't even know what it was.
Well, it was more the attitude. We weren't making people to go there, or I wasn't even reviewing anybody at the time. I don't even remember how it worked. I was managing all the artists. I was the, lead artist, which later was termed the art director, which technically should have been the creative director with everything I ended up doing.
Yeah.
But I don't remember ever I think Rob gave everybody reviews. I never managed anybody.
Lucky.
And it was more like, it was literally, there was passionate people who wanted to do it, and they seemed to all gravitate towards our project, either by choice or by being thrown on our project because nobody else wanted them. And it's self-selected. I mean, even the people who didn't, I don't recall, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I don't recall ever having a conversation with an artist like, you're not putting in enough time. It was literally about what they were delivering. It wasn't even about how much they were delivering, because I had no idea what was a common amount of artwork to get done. And I had nothing to gauge it by, because I had done the stuff on Stonekeep on my own. And then as soon as I was full-time doing characters and 3D stuff, I still was working, 12, 15 hours, not because anybody asked me, but because I was just so into it. And also because I felt like I was really slow. So I didn't feel like you should have to stay this long to do it. I just felt like, that's just who I am. And that's how I work. So literally any of the problems I had with artists was 100% whether I thought they could do the job or not. And people who couldn't do the job were moved off the project. And the other horrible thing that we did all the time, which is horrible to ourselves, was that after a while, me and Jason just started going like, you know what, we'll just do it. It's like everything that started to go like we couldn't find somebody to do it. We're just like, dope, we'll do it.
Yep.
We just took on everything. We did, on the plus side, it really taught me a lot about making a game because I think I did everything on that game except for actual scripting and any kind of programming. In terms of, I did artwork, I did writing, design. I didn't actually build maps because we needed Scotty to do that for us. But you know, it was the cool thing was, we really got me and Jason were really in control of what the art looked like in a really big way, without having to. Gary Plattner was on the team too, and he was really, keyed into what we were doing. We saw his portfolio come in,
There
and
was
it
no
really kind of fit.
micromanaging. There was no
No,
micro. Everybody was going in the right direction, which is something I didn't realize till years later was
yeah,
part of the special sauce. Is that we picked a direction and just kept pointing in that direction, and everybody went there.
yep,
And
yeah.
that was special. In fact, I've got a lot of questions about art that came up on
Okay.
the channel. The biggest one that people have asked repeatedly is the clay heads. It's like, where'd the idea come from? Why did we do clay heads? And why weren't there more clay heads?
Well, I know why there weren't more because it took a long time to do them.
So why did we even do them?
Um, I believe because at that time you couldn't scan things. You
Why
It
not
was
just
really
make a head in 3D?
well, it was really hard to make things in 3D. Make organic things in 3D. It was really good at hard surface modeling, but making anything organic. And I tried to make heads from scratch. And I know that some people had done it and they looked okay, and you could buy pre-made heads. But what they did is they literally, by they I mean us as well as other people who are doing it, is you would have to take a pen and you would like have a model or a person's face. And generally, the reason they didn't do people's faces in those days as much was because you put a grid on this thing with a lot of little dots, way more than you see now when they're doing any kind of facial capture, which they don't even have to use dots anymore. But even when it became this thing that the public knew about, it was a lot less dots than we had to use early on. And they'd have this stylus, and they would click on a dot, enter, click on the next dot, enter, click on. I mean, they're basically building this framework of pixels or of points that they could then generate a mesh
I
out
mean,
of.
a vertex mesh.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Scott was making creatures for
Clay Fighter?
what was he doing? Because he wasn't working on D&D. D&D
Wasn't
didn't
it Clay
exist.
Fighter?
I don't know.
I thought it was. I thought he did Clay Fighter, and then he started doing clay models for D&D, and we had him do clay heads.
But when did D&D start? D&D didn't start until like we were like a year in, right?
Yeah, but we didn't start the clay heads right away either.
It all is a jumble. I mean, I remember I remember the stuff we did, but the timeline
Well,
when I try
that's
to
why I wanted
figure
to
out.
ask you is my notes on art are very incomplete. I actually know when Scott started. I could look it up, but I know he was doing. Didn't he had a foot pedal at one point? He stopped doing the enter key, and I think he
Oh
went.
yeah,
He could
that's
go.
right.
He'd go boom, and then bam his foot, and then go boom, bam his foot, and he would do that all day long by
I
himself.
So I have no idea where I got the idea that like we could make clay heads. I'm sure I talked to him and said, "Hey, can you make me a clay head?"
What was the first head?
I don't remember because he made a clay head.
Was it Overseer? I thought it was Overseer.
No, it wasn't because well, what I did is I drew a bunch of different. I drew like 4 or 5 base heads, and then I would make variations on those. So it would be like, here's what the head should look like, and here's the different characters we can build off of that head. So Scott would make the basic head, and then I think we did tweaks in the editor or in the engine, not in the engine, in Power Animator.
Well, I know you had to do the mouth through
Yeah,
certain configurations, so then later Jason
but
Swin could lip sync.
the reason I know it's not the Overseer is because I made the Overseer. Like I saw Scott making heads, and I said I have to make one of those. Every time somebody did something cool in the game, I'm like I have to do that. So like I literally I think did one of everything at the very least. So he was making the heads, and I'm like, oh, show me how to do that. And I made it. It was made out of this clay called Sculpey, which was really cool to work with. And so I made the overseer head. He scanned it in, and then I textured it, and I made the background for it. I'm pretty sure I made the background for it, or maybe we just did a screenshot of the vault or something. But I was really proud of that for a number of reasons. Number one, it looked really cool. Number two was like his skin wasn't just a flat color. You know, he had like people's faces are not one color. So I really put a lot of effort into figuring out how to make across the board, actually, not just on heads, of like things that weren't just a block color. And at the time, if you look back at what people were doing in 3D, it was always shiny and it was always like, oh, this thing's green, so here's a green color on it. It was like flat.
That's Jason Anderson's favorite quote in our quote file. But do you know what? Do you know it's hard to render dust or dirt?
Yeah, it's hard to make things dirty or whatever. Yeah, and it's true because everything looked really, really clean and you had to scuff it up. So, but the other thing is, so I did the texturing on him. But the thing that I was really proud of, and this is the kind of thing I'd put way too much time into that probably didn't need to be done, is if you look at it and look at his hair, it's totally unimpressive nowadays. It's probably unimpressive 10 years after I did it. But like he had a bunch of different, we called cards, right? It was like you couldn't make somebody's hair. There was way too many pixels and vertexes and all that. So you'd have to make chunks. And what I did was like I made alpha maps that I'd put onto every chunk of hair that made it look like hair, and I layered them on top of each other. And it didn't look like a hair helmet. It looked like actual, I mean, it was bad 3D, but
it was impressive.
But at the time I was like really like, oh, that's so cool. It just is, it's really something you didn't see. I mean, no one had done those talking heads. And even when I said we should do them, I'm like, it's really cool because you can see these characters up close. We can show emotion on them and stuff. But I did realize even at the time, it was kind of like an artistic indulgence. I was like, I really want to see this. I really want to do this. I really want it to be in the game. And you know, in Arcanum, we had no talking heads.
But you not only used that head in-game dialogue, that was the opening cinematic. He appeared in there.
Yeah.
I mean, that was how detailed he was. In fact, somebody asked, did you use the same models in game as you used in cinematics? And that was one right there. How about the guy walking into the desert? That's not the sprite from the game?
It actually started with the sprite. The sprite. Well, see, the thing with the sprites is, you know, they're tiny. You're looking at them from this, what is it, cavalier oblique angle. Not isometric.
I thought you were going to say we pulled the camera infinitely back.
Well, that too.
Zoomed in because that's how we got the orthographic, the
non-perspective. Jason figured that out just like he figured out how we're going to tile stuff. I saw one of the questions was, you know, how did we split up buildings? I'd be like, I don't know. You'd have to ask Jason because I made that gas station where Doc Morbid is. I just made it, and it was, I'm sure, horribly made in terms of like trying to tile it and cut it up into tiles. I'm like, hey, Jason, can you make this into and he had to like.
The worst thing about that is Jason invented the technique. And I think I started it and someone else finished the actual utility that cut it up. And then Scotty had to put those wall segments together by hand.
Yeah.
And then years later, when working on Arcanum, I went, you know, I could probably automate that. So you could just go zip and it would just select all the wall segments.
Scotty.
Oh, but Scotty had that focus that I've rarely seen in people where he could sit at his desk for hours doing something and he'd end up with this. The map was flawless. There were no misplaced ground tiles. There were no misplaced wall tiles. It just looked flawless. We ended up, and that's, every time I talk about Fallout, I end up saying how lucky or how fortunate or how coincidental that these people came together, that these things happened. A lot of people wanted to know where Vault Boy came from. And that was an evolution of.
Yeah. Well, so let me finish answering the question because I didn't finish answering the question. So the model I used, so when we were doing isometric ones, you had to do weird things like proportion them weirdly so that the things you wanted to stick out for their silhouettes, you could see them at that size. So if I had just rendered it, which we did, remember that Vault 13 logo me and Jason made? It was basically the guy in leather armor.
Oh yeah,
that was literally just the model, and it was horrible looking because you're not supposed to view it from that angle. So I took the basic one and I don't even remember how I up-resed it, or maybe I think I actually down-resed it from a different model to get the one we worked with. So I went back to the basic original version, and then it was a naked guy, and I, I think you gave me crap for this one day. I'm literally like pulling out, you know what I'm gonna say, right? I'm like pulling out the center of his butt so he doesn't have this big butt crack. And you're like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm pulling the pixels out of his butt.
I've seen artists do worse.
Yeah. So anyways, yeah. So um, sorry, you'd asked a question about
It wasn't the same sprite. You made a whole new
no,
sprite. Oh,
yeah. So I made that, but then you had asked me something that I interrupted to go
the
back to
Vault
that.
Boy? Where
Yes,
Vault
the
Boy
Vault
came
Boy.
from.
So yeah, GURPS has, I don't remember how many skills and different things we were doing when it was GURPS, and I was having an artist make icons for it, and I was signing off on the icons. I was working with them to kind of like iterate on the icons, um, and I saw them on screen in the interface, and I'm like, I have no idea what any of these are.
And no one
I made
else knew what they
I
were.
made these. I art directed. I didn't make them. I art directed these. I worked with the person who's developing to make them communicate as much as we could. I have no idea what any of these are.
It's because they were symbolic. You know, it's like,
Yes,
here's a hammer. Is that
and
hammer or is that repair?
well, we ended up doing that with Arcanum, so I don't know if it worked or not, but
You didn't have 100 and some skills.
that too. So, anyways, I was driving home. This is the same thing. Perhaps I'm conflating these two things, but the two best ideas I ever had came. I was living in Corona at the time, which people who live in Southern California know. Going from Corona to Irvine, especially during rush hours, is a long drive. It's probably like an hour, maybe a little bit more. Even without traffic, it's probably a good half an hour, 45 minutes. So I'd have to do that drive every morning and every night. And the first thing that happened was I decided, weirdly, for some bizarre reason that I still can't quite figure out, hey, because we had been up until this time, we'd been making basically Road Warrior in terms of the art. It's like everything like Spikes, post-apocalyptic. It was 90s science fiction.
You guys had that movie going in a TV, you and Jason in your
Yeah,
office.
we had Road Warrior playing on a loop. Well, we'd have to rewind it because it was a videotape, but it was constantly playing, and that was huge. We were just like, no, we're making our ode to the Road Warrior. And so I hadn't really even thought, which is funny, thinking of how me and you develop games now and how we progressed. It took me a good 6, 8 months to even think about like, hey, we should do something kind of original that's our own thing. It was just like, I'm like, it wasn't even questioned. It's just like, oh, this is our like rip off Road Warrior.
Yep.
Awesome. It's
Road
gonna be
Road.
cool.
Road
Yeah.
Road.
So I was, one day I'm like driving home or driving to work, and I'm like, it'd be really cool if this was some kind of weird post-apocalyptic version of like a 50s science fiction future. And retrofuturism, I actually looked it up recently. It's a term that's been around forever, so it wasn't something that came up with Fallout. But I don't know that I ever heard anybody mention it. I had seen, I was really big in into pulp science fiction. I was, anybody our age, when Star Wars came out, it was like the hugest thing ever, because we're in, with 12, 13 years old when the first one came out. And, I'd read all the like Star Logs and science fiction magazines where they talked all about it. And George Lucas talked a lot about the world building and all the things that went into building that world. And to me, that was really fascinating, and like all that stuff that went into it. But even then, he really originally wanted to make Flash Gordon, which is a very pulpy 1930s thing. And so perhaps that was part of it. But I'm like, the 50s aesthetic, which I always described it as the 50s. It was really more like 40s, but I digress. Um, the 50s post-apocalyptic, aesthetic thing. And I came in and I remember, I don't remember if I told you or Rob first. You looked confused,
I
and
always look
Rob,
that way.
yeah, well, that's true. And then Rob also looked confused, but and God bless Rob. I praise him for this all the time. It's just like he looked like he didn't know what I was talking about, which I'm sure was part of me like not describing it well. But he's like, well, you seem really passionate about it. I think you should go ahead and do it. And so we did. And so we're making a game now that we're putting in all this 1940s, 1950s kind of retro future stuff. And then after the icon thing started happening, I was driving home one night, and I just had this vision of like Mr. Uncle Pennybags. I still don't always
From
get his name
Monopoly.
wrong. The Monopoly character. I'm like, we should have Monopoly cards, and we need a character that looks like that to like be really like, like he shot a gun and his hands were exploded because he had a critical fail, and he's standing there with no hands and blood dripping off of his arms and smiling because it's great, everything's cool. And I don't, so that came to me just like this weird vision out of nowhere. And I came in and told you, and unlike the first time I came in and told you something crazy, you immediately were like, that's a really good idea. We should totally do that.
Actually, I think, I want to say it was universal. Everyone on the team loved it, which is why I was so surprised when we got pushback from Steve Jackson games, because we were still GURPS. I mean, because he literally said, no one in the office here likes it. And I was like, I find that incredulous. I was incredulous because I'm like, literally everybody here likes it. Even people outside the team like it, and they all get it. And
yeah, no one got the retro feature thing until they saw it.
See, here's what I think worked for us, because like you brought that 50s aesthetic. I liked my dark ambient music. You threw in that Monopoly stuff. The reason it all worked was it wasn't just, hey, everybody had a bunch of ideas and we just threw them together. It was everybody was already making a game in a certain direction, and they had various ideas that supported it. And it took me a long time to realize later when I'd work with people like, I want to do this and this. And it's like, those are all great ideas, but they don't belong in this game. Yeah. We had ideas that really did belong, and they made Fallout not Wasteland. Like Chris Taylor and I were reading all these sci-fi novels.
Yeah.
And we were like, we want something like Canticle of Leibowitz, and the Brotherhood of Steel came out of that. That people who wanted to preserve the past. And it all fit. It worked. And it worked with the 50s aesthetic because you made that power armor, which is now massively iconic. And big old head over there.
It's really funny though, because even though I seemingly came up with this idea out of left field, we didn't go back and change any artwork that he'd already made, with the exception of the power armor. But that was different.
Yeah, the leather jacket from Mad Max, and
well, that came later. So we had all of our armors already made. We didn't change any of that. We had a bunch of artwork already made. We didn't change that. I think there was a little bit creeping in even before I thought about it, because if you look at Alien, the first Alien, like their aesthetic was a huge influence, and it's very World War II bomber. Like that cockpit literally has pieces of World War II bomber in it. Like the switches and stuff were literally off of old World War II airplanes, as far as I remember. And so we were already kind of like influenced by that, but it hadn't become official. And then but when I made that change, when we made that change, it didn't change anything. It didn't change and I really look back on it now and I'm like, we were making like this B-movie, weird pulpy sci-fi thing already without even making that as a decision. It just was like our personalities. It was the stuff we were all into. The vibe, the tone of it wasn't something we designed. It was literally the tone of Fallout is literally how it was when the 5 or 6 of us, whatever it was, were sitting in the conference room talking about what we thought the game would be, the jokes we'd made that we thought were going to be funny in the game, some of which never made it in, like Irvine, and Brian Fargo's car and all that stuff, the Viper. All that's, none of that would have fit eventually, but it was literally like just kind of, we just went in that direction, like you're saying. And, to this day, I think it was kind of like in the back of my brain or something. Another big influence was this comic book called Hard Boiled, which was really kind of like a weird retro feature thing too, which we put the gun from that in there. We also put the Blade Runner gun in there. And it was just, to me, that's when it started to really gel. It was like all of a sudden we'd been kind of running, I feel like on like just kind of going with our instincts. But it's like when we changed to that and then came up with the Vault Boy, it like really started to focus everything we were doing. The Pit Boy was a cross between the Jetsons and Bob's Big Boy. The Mad Max armor was funny because we already had leather armor. And Chris Taylor came to me and he's like, we need another armor set. And it's supposed to be in between leather was our base one, right? The original leather. It's supposed to be between that or wait, I don't remember where it ended up being. But anyways, we needed to fill this slot because from design standpoint we needed it. And I go like, again, I have no idea what I thought of this, probably because there's the Road Warrior playing in the background at the time. I'm like, if I made him look like the Road Warrior, would that fit what you're looking for? He's like, yeah, that would totally work. And I literally made it look exactly like Mel Gibson in the Road Warrior. The outfit he was wearing, everything. Today we'd probably get sued, but that doesn't fit anywhere in our 1950s aesthetic. And that was even after we decided to do that.
And then that inspired, because we had dogs in the game, it inspired someone to try to put in dog meat and make him come to you because you're wearing the Mad Max outfit. The whole discussion about how ink spots got picked was something that's come up as a question of like, we didn't plan on that. It just happened.
Yeah. A couple years back, I think it was when we were making the original Outer Worlds, someone had contacted Brian to interview him about the intro, and he said, I don't know much about it. You should talk to Leonard because he's the one who put it together. And he always loved it. I mean, that's the thing. I saw your other video about how no one really got Interplay. No one really got it at Interplay until Brian played it and said it was cool. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, everybody can be into it now. They've got permission.
Yes, they were allowed.
But I do remember, like, we made the intro and Brian saw the intro and he said something along the lines of, we can do something that's kind of like art, or something like that. This is art, as opposed to just a video game. This feels like art. And I was like, he totally gets what we're doing, which had been not the case up until that point.
Well, remember when you did the new Interplay logo? We got a little pushback on that because we were supposed to use the standard Interplay laser.
Well, that was from the intro itself.
Yeah,
we did the Galaxy News Network one.
You did that anyway. We weren't supposed to make our new logo, but you just said, this will look good. And then people liked it.
I feel like that was my idea, but it could have totally been Jason saying we should use that. Me and Jason sat in the same office. Like, we could argue all day long about whether me or him came up with certain things, because I feel like we were kind of like one mind at that point.
That's why it's hard to attribute things, because you discuss them and then later on the other person would go, wasn't that my idea? It's like, I don't know. I thought it was my idea. I thought I brought it up, but I thought I'd already thought of it. Yeah. And that's how close we all were.
Yeah, and that's happened several times where it's kind of like, and sometimes it wasn't like, no, I came up with that idea and you came up with that idea. It wasn't that either of us was wrong. We like literally came up with the idea independent of each other and would show up with it.
Do you know what was interesting about that? I don't know if you watched when I did a video about where the name for Fallout came up. The name Fallout is in the list of things that
I was surprised by that. I didn't remember that.
It's on a dated thing. I have the exact date.
What I do remember is Jason always wanted to name games Moribund World. And Remains of
Moribund everything.
And Remains of the Day was a joke. He wasn't serious. It was like there was like, the English Patient. There was like some T.H. Lawrence novel or movie at the time. So Jason was just throwing out stuff like that.
Hey, it went on the list.
Yeah, we're horrible at naming things, definitely. But anyways, back to the ink spots. So the reason I got sidetracked by the whole Brian thing was because when I did that interview, I really sat. I don't think I'd ever really thought about this. I'm like, where did that come from? Like, what was I trying to do? Because me and Jason designed what the intro was going to be based off our constraints. I know we say this all the time in interviews, but like, constraints are really good because they make you be creative. We're like, we cannot show people close up. It is impossible at that point in time to do really good looking people, which is why we had to do clay heads close up. We can get into why we didn't go 3D, because we had, at one point, we were considering whether going to be a first person 3D game. So we started with a list of like, what can't we do? Can't show people close up. Well, we want to show people at some point. So how do we do that? What if it's like a grainy documentary, and not only that, it's like on a television set that by the time you see the people, the camera's already kind of pulled back. And that kind of coincided with us like coming up with the idea of like, this was a ruined building. And so I had this vibe in my head of what I wanted it to feel like. It was very melancholy, very kind of sad and somehow poignant. I didn't know what I was like chasing, but it's like I kind of knew what I wanted it to be. And so we tried to start looking for a song, like, what's the music going to be? What do I want to do? Now, when I did this interview that Brian had set me up with, I realized it was a combination of, like, at the beginning of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, there is a really kind of melancholy piano playing by itself, and you hear the film projector, and they're showing this like a silent movie version of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which ironically they had actually made for part of the movie, and they cut it. So they're like, well, we have this laying around. So it happens in every industry. They're like, we have this laying around. We use it for the intro. And it was really kind of like haunting. And then the other, combined with the end of Doctor Strangelove, where they're playing We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn as the bombs are dropping. And if I had remembered that, I would have tried to get us to use We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn, because that which would have been 2 on the nose.
Yeah.
So thankfully I didn't remember that, but I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know what it was. And Gary Plattner brought in, I don't remember where he got it. I don't think he just mentioned it. I think he actually brought in the CD or something.
Was it? No, he had a shoebox of CDs. I remember at one point.
No, you're thinking about. No, you're. We'll get to that in a second.
Oh, okay.
So he brought in "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire." He could have just said it because I knew what it was. It was actually even in the very first trailer, I think, for Blade Runner. You can find it online. It's in there because they were really trying to sell that as a noir, future noir kind of thing. And the minute he said that, I'm like, yes, that is awesome. Not only is it got that weird haunting sound, it also is this bad joke, right? I don't want to set the world on fire. Ha 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 ha.
We already did.
Yeah, it's when you think about it, it's kind of like, couldn't we go a little bit deeper than that?
It's a little too on the nose.
Yeah. So again, luck reared its ugly head, and they're like, nope, they wanted too much money for it. So Charles Deenan had these cases, these big boxes of they were like binders of CDs with, I think it was songs from the 30s to the 50s or something like that. And there had to be 4 or 5 of them. There were huge boxes. Me and Jason literally spent a couple of days just loading up these CDs and skipping between songs till we found one. And then one day I'm skipping through these CDs and I landed on one and I'm like, oh, this is just I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. And he starts singing and I'm like, this isn't I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. It wasn't until later that I realized that most of their songs pretty much sound like that. But I'm like, holy shit, we can use this, I think. So we went and got the licensing for that. And that was before we had decided we were kicking the Vault Dweller out of the vault.
Which I will go on record as saying, I thought that was a bad idea. I thought it should be a big party with balloons and a cake.
Exactly. Well, there's two things.
Luckily, you won.
Well, there's, again, great ideas come out of constraints, because our original idea for the battle in the documentary at the intro, or the news footage in the intro, was literally just, we're going to see a battle between 2 sides. Like, okay, number 1, that's going to be really hard to do. Yeah. Number 2, that's not a story. There's like nothing happening there. Do we just want a shot of that? We should do something cool. And so I turned to Jason and I'm like, hey, Jason, I'm going to have him go up and basically execute a guy point blank range. And then I'm going to have the guy wave at the camera. Should I do that? And of course, Jason starts egging me on. And, we do that stuff all the time. And then, when I said, like, let's kick the guy out of the vault, which again, everything goes back to the Road Warrior, because the thing at the end of the Road Warrior was a great movie. For me, it became a classic at the end when it turned into a myth. And they start, and he's the lone wanderer that is like left standing there, and like, he's basically exiled. He exiled himself, but he's exiled from the tribe. And so the minute either me or Jason came up with that, or we both came up with it simultaneously, I was just like, we have to do that. And I don't know if you know this, but I was going to do it regardless if you told me I could or not. So
I know it now. Well, how does that different than the previous several years?
Exactly. But so when we did that, it's like all of a sudden I'm like, the only reason we picked Maybe was because it sounded like I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, wait a minute. If you like listening, and at first I'm like, okay, that's kind of like maybe I'll come back again someday, maybe, which is kind of works with the intro, because it's like, it's humanity as a whole saying maybe I'll come back someday. But then we kicked him out of the vault. I'm like, if we use the music for this, it turns into a song about, it's like it works for the intro and it becomes personal at the end. I
remember when you told me that. I remember when you said, and here's a song we picked, and it's perfect for the beginning, and it's perfect for the end. And I was like, oh. And then I think I told you that Christmas I went home, found out it was my mother and my grandfather's favorite band,
Yep.
the Ink Spots, and that my mother had gone. My grandfather had taken my mom to a concert of theirs when she was like 4 or 5. Got in trouble with my grandmother for keeping, baby Margie out that long. But
Yeah.
it was just weird how many things like that happened. And afterwards, we're like, that was complete. I mean, Gary just happened to find that song, and then you happened to be going through a box that Charles happened to have.
And there were so many things that were not mistakes, or there were so many things that weren't quite what we were trying to do. Like I said, if I had remembered the end of Doctor Strangelove was what I was trying to copy, I would have gone like, let's see if we can get that song.
Yep.
We couldn't get I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, which was to me not as good of a choice as Maybe. All along the way, going back to the start of this conversation, if Spencer hadn't have quit, I would never have been the art director. Fallout wouldn't have looked the way it did.
We can go back before anybody was on the team. If I was a better programmer, Fallout might have been a 3D game. But my 3D engine was terrible.
Well, there was that, but I remember us actually talking about it, and I was just like, no, we can't do that because 3D sucks. 3D games at that point in time were ugly, and like you had 5. I mean, look at the original Tomb Raider, which came out right around that time.
It worked for something.
They did a great job with using that, but I was like really coming from my background. I was really into the fidelity of like the detail and the grime and the grit. Which the other thing that I spent so much time on things no one noticed or no one cared about. You know how Jason said it was so tough to make things dirty, but we had to palette. We had a 256 color palette. It was 128 actually though, because we had to
256.
We had to reserve some for the interface
and for color cycling. So you did lose some of that.
So anyways, we had this, and we would do this thing where we had to palette true color images. We run it through this program on a Mac called the Babelizer, which, because you could only do it for a certain number of files at a time, we had to come up with these weird batch files, and we couldn't do them all at once because there was too many files. It was archaic. But anyways, so when you did that, it would pixelate, and the pixels would move on it. And ironically, I learned how to do this in my first job where I was cutting things out of background and it would cut away parts of the characters. I'd have to go in and pixel it. But if you made it too smooth or made it too like, well, I'll just put this color in here, it didn't work because it was like the rest of it had these pixels moving all around it. So you actually had to go in there and make bad pixelization fake. You had to fake bad pixelization so it would work. So when I was doing that stuff and we were paletting it, I would make textures in a way, and I'd spend way too long in this, where the pixelization would happen in such a way that it made it look dirty, not like it was low res. So it's like the way we made things look dirty is we had this thing in classic game development or artist. I'm sure programmers do this too. Every time you're making a new executable or whatever, we had this thing called NWAL. And the reason it was called NWAL is because I started with wall, and then it was AWAL, and then it was BWAL. When I got to end, it was this. It was like Rust, I think, and it was a couple of things I put together in Photoshop with different layers where it was just one image, where it just had this weird juxtaposition of different colors that we would use. And I used that for people's skin, and sometimes it was exactly what I would use. Sometimes I would just use that as like an overlay to show where different colors would hit, all these different things we do. But that coupled with our pixelization to me was like, our stuff looks like it's not necessarily pixelated. It looks like it's dirty, and it looks like it's dusty. And no one ever picked up on that. People are like, why is it so kind of gray and grungy looking?
Do you remember how much time we spent making sure that when people walked, their feet didn't slide? And I mean, I'm scared how much hours you and I lost to it personally. And then Diablo comes out and everyone's like super slidey, and no one cared. No one cared. We did that a lot.
It's tough though, because like even now, like in my gut, I'm like, would I have like made the choice not to do that?
Yeah.
No, I would have made people not. Because it was so cool to me, and that's the thing. We were so, at least I was, and I know Jason and you were. I'm sure a lot of people were like this on the team. I was so into every little thing I did. It's just like when I was doing animation, I'd never animated before. Well, before Stonekeep, I didn't do any human animation in Stonekeep because we had the full video for human beings. Um, but I was animating these characters and I was making sure the weight distribution worked and that like you could see them push off and that there was no like weird jitter when they went back to their stand pose. Again, things we could have really just kind of like fudged our way through. And I don't know that people noticed it or even notice it now. But I personally believe, and this could just be me justifying my own obsessions, I really believe it makes a difference. I really believe it makes it feel more weighty. It feels more grounded to me.
I think all of us had things that we wanted something done to a certain quality level.
Yeah.
And even though maybe individually those weren't noticed, but I think all together it kind of made the game feel a little richer. I don't know. It's hard to.
I think so.
It's like when I tell people this is not a science. That's
Yeah.
why we didn't have it planned, where there weren't details and all that. There's as much art going into this and you doing it as feel. And you know what's interesting is I just looked. We've been talking for an hour.
We can do
All
this
I
for
got
another
through
3 hours.
were the Fallout questions, and I had Fallout 2 questions, Arcanum questions, Vampire.
Did we get
questions.
through? Did we get through all of the Fallout questions?
We got through all the big Fallout questions that people had asked. I was gonna jump into Fallout 2 and even try to do Arcanum, but it's been an hour.
We've talked about this at length, but the last thing that we kind of touched on it, but we didn't really go into it, is the fact that Steve Jackson, again, another lucky thing, because I remember I picked you up from the airport. I think it was Christmas or Thanksgiving. You had gone home to visit your family. I picked you up from the airport, and this is when I was 100% on the art side. We had done a lot of the early design together. That's why I put in the manual the original game design by the original 5 or 6 people who were in the pizza meetings, where we basically came up with the heart of what Fallout was going to be,
including Scott Campbell, who doesn't get talked about a lot anymore.
Yeah, like he came up with the name for Junktown. He came up with a lot of our settings that made it into the final game. But so I was like asking you, I'm like, so on the design side, what do you think? Is this going to be a good game? Are people going to like this? And you're just like, I think this is going to be a fantastic GURPS game, but I don't think other people are going to get this. It's just too complex. There's too much going on. It's really like, it's just really fit. And just like you did with Temple, it's like when we got into something that was a pre-existing thing, we got hardcore. It's just like we wanted it to feel like Dungeons and Dragons. We wanted it to feel like GURPS. We didn't want to cut corners, and that was what you guys had done. You made this very true to GURPS thing with as much stuff as you could put in it that would work in a video game, or not quite work as it turned out. So you were kind of a little bit bummed. You were like, I think we're making something great here, but I don't think it's going to really turn out like we think it is, because the GURPS thing is just too difficult. And I don't know how much longer it was after that Steve Jackson, got all upset about the intro and the Vault Boy.
1 month.
And again, the fact that Brian told him, the reason we put the Brian Fargo Presents besides him just letting us make this game is like at that point, Steve Jackson started talking lawyers, and instead of like being, what a lot of business would have done, was like, it's just not worth the hassle. We're not going to deal with it. Brian was like, no, I like what these guys are doing. I'm not telling them to take that stuff out. And, it was, again, it's like I don't have any idea what those people were seeing in terms of, the violence, which he had seen the setting people on fire, by the way.
Well, the other thing too, when I was talking, I don't know if you saw my video yesterday where I want people to approach this with nuance. Steve Jackson is also not the bad guy in this. They really thought, well, I have to be careful because GURPS is our brand and we have to protect it.
Yeah.
I think what we were thinking was, I love GURPS. I fought to get GURPS. I wanted it. I was the one who was like promoting it. At the same time, Fallout had become this thing that maybe wasn't fitting with GURPS. Yeah. And I think that was that discussion on the ride home from the airport of, we have this great game and I have this great set of libraries that implement GURPS rules, and they're not quite connecting. And then to discover a month later, well, they don't like some of the stuff on the Fallout side. We're like, well, I don't want to get rid of that. I don't want to get rid of either of them. So I actually thought, because I was told, oh, we'll separate it, make new, because I was like, hey, everything's a library. I can plug it out. And they said, we'll use your library for another game. Yeah. And I just was like, okay. And I didn't question it. I just went, okay, that's what will happen.
Well, it again shows why we are horrible business people and way too obsessed with the work we do, because we knew that GURPS was probably hurting the project. We would have fought to make a GURPS game, even though we knew that it probably wasn't what was best for the project, because we set out to make a GURPS game. We were going to make a GURPS game. We were committed to making a GURPS game. We would have made a GURPS game if he hadn't, if that hadn't happened.
It's weird that number of things that happened that at the time felt horrible.
Yes.
Yeah. And then later, sometimes months later or years later, we were like, oh, thank goodness that happened. But then, as usual, people are like, oh, let's make a story about the heroes and villains of this real thing that happened. And it's like people can't even imagine, well, there's got to be a bad guy here. I'm going to try to figure out who it is. There isn't really a bad guy. There's just a situation happened that did not have an optimal solution.
We've told this story many times. I'm sure you've covered it, of like how we ended up doing the cover. Again, it was because of the obsession thing. It's like, so I had designed that, I don't even know if you remember, I still have the drawing of it, this really bad 90s sci-fi looking power armor. Looks nothing like the power armor in the game. I'd actually done it, and it took a long time to do all those animations, because you couldn't do something with it seems like you might have been able to, but you tried to figure it out. Jason tried to figure it out. If you and Jason couldn't figure it out, I'm pretty sure we couldn't do it at that time, where it would have been great if we could have just had the automatically copy animations over. We had to like open up both files and like hand copy animations over. So we had all the animations for all the different animations a character could do, but every time we put in a new armor, we had to hand copy them over. And so I was making the intro, and I had to do a close-up of that power armor helmet, and I started to model the one I had that was based on this drawing, the one that was in the game. And within like maybe an hour, I was like, this is crap. I'm not going to make this. And I started thinking, and this is probably around the time that we discovered City Lost Children, because I know that's where the IP thing came from.
Yeah.
I just started building this thing from scratch. Like, I never could have drawn this. This was totally out of my wheelhouse in terms of like concepting stuff, but I just started modeling this thing from scratch with nothing. I just had this vague image in my head of a feeling I wanted from this thing, a very industrial thing. Again, that's not really, you don't look at that and go 50s. That's like just our, this hardcore mechanical thing, like the cockpit behind me that Tor made for the, one of our original concepts for the Outer Worlds. Tor Frick, by the way, awesome concept artist, if anybody wants to give him work. So I just started making that helmet, and I got so into it, I would come in on the weekends and spend the whole day just making this really, really high-res version of it.
I was in the office next door, yeah.
That was going to be shrunk down for the intro. We had no other plans for it. It was only going to be there, but I loved it so much. I'm like, I'm going to make it. And then on top of that, I went in and on my own time and remade the rest of the armor and recopied it for, which of course was not an easy thing to do. And then when push came to shove and we had to make our own cover, we had this high-res version of it because I was so obsessive about what I was doing. And it's like every story seems to cycle back to us being crazy obsessive with us wanting to make this game.
I remember you working on it, and I'd look in occasionally, and what I remembered the most was the time you were spending on those tubes.
Yeah.
Because they not only had a cool texture on them, but the way they had the ridges, and I was like, are we gonna see that?
You did in the box cover. Yeah. It was funny because we went to a class on how to use Power Animator after having worked with it for 3 years. So they started to have these classes because more people were using it. So we went to this thing, and there was this thing I can't even remember. It was an animation something, and I thought it was for animation. It was like something where you had a spline and you could animate something along it. But what that did is you created a model by animating it. I had no idea what that was. I never even looked it up because I'm like, this is something to do with animation. It's too advanced for me. And they showed us that, and I'm like, I wonder if you can scale those. So like I did this thing with a big circle and a small circle going along a spline, and I don't remember how it works, but like, and then you animate it and it made that. And I spent like probably a good day like playing around with the size of how big each of those should be, what the actual curve was from the back of the helmet. Yeah, the obsession. Luckily, we had the energy of youth to do that.
Yep, it's funny. You're making me think of all the things I obsessed about. Like I hated the random number generator that came with our C compiler.
Yeah.
So we started making our own, and we finally picked one out of a book I think called Numerical Recipes in C. It was like, and we were like, it had a period and a chi-square that was beyond anything we would need for a game, which is why I was shocked when QA started complaining. And they're like, hey, I missed 3 times in a row when I had a 95% chance. And I was doing the math on the whiteboard going, this can happen. In fact, this should happen about once a week in your testing. And it was just, why did I even do that? Why didn't I just go, every other game probably ships with the RAND from the C library. I'll just use that. But no, that wasn't good enough. It wasn't, I think that was just us.
Yeah.
It's just what we did.
But it's been like 15, 20 minutes since you said we should be done.
Let's stop here. And you know what? Maybe you can come back at some point. I got questions about Fallout 2. Well, I should say I do. People have put questions in the channel and I've extracted them. Fallout 2, Arcanum, Vampire, things I literally can't answer either because I wasn't involved or it was an art thing and I only watched it being done and I don't really know the answers. Or quest stuff. There's some quest stuff in there that only you know the answer to.
Yeah, if I even remember. We'll see. Maybe no one will watch this and we won't be obligated to do it anymore.
Well, thank you for doing it. And maybe I can convince you to do it again.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you have my phone number. You can give me a call.
I know where you live.
Exactly.
All right.
All right, Tim. It was great talking to you. We'll talk to you later.